We are joined by Matthew McManus, political science lecturer at the University of Michigan and author of The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, which I'm very excited to discuss as a topic. But I want to start by saying thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem, man. Thanks a lot for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Yeah, anytime. So I want to start with having you dive into what liberal socialism is, as I'm sure there's plenty of liberals and especially those on the right who would say that these two things are kind of antithetical to each other. So how do you define this in a way that these two ideologies kind of merge?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I point out following Alan Ryan, who's an important political theorist, is that it makes a lot more sense to talk about political ideologies in terms of a family of different ways of thinking about things that share some resemblance to one another, sometimes even very important resemblances to one another, but differ in substantial ways. So he says it makes a lot more sense to talk about things like liberalisms or socialisms rather than just liberalism or socialism or, for that matter, conservatism, right? So what I point out in my book is there are many different forms of liberalism, some of which are more friendly to capitalism, and some of which even think that capitalism is a requirement of liberalism, and some of which are much more critical and even hostile to capitalism. So the kind of liberalism that I argue is associated with a defensive market society is what C.B. Macpherson called a possessive strain of individualism, or possessive liberalism, as it's sometimes called. And basically, possessive individualists and possessive individualist liberals tend to think that human society consists of individuals. Individuals are self-interested. And for the most part, we go about pursuing our self-interest without much regard to other people around us, right? We're fundamentally a kind of acquisitive, competitive species, going back to people like, say, for instance, Thomas Hobbes. But there's another strain of liberalism that is much more aware of the fact that human beings are social animals and that it's only possible to fully flourish in a hospitable social environment. And virtually every liberal socialist who I talk about in my book falls into that category. And liberal socialists, I argue, are people like John Stuart Mills, John Rawls, Chantal Mouffe, and they're committed to three central principles. The first is a commitment to methodological collectivism and normative individualism. Those are complicated terms that I unpack a fair bit, but basically it just means that liberal socialists understand that individuals can only flourish in the right social setting, but it's important that individuals flourish rather than various kinds of abstraction, right? So it's important that your life goes well, my life goes well, not necessarily that the nation do well, understood in these kinds of abstract terms. The second principle that I argue all liberal socialists are committed to is a developmental rather than an acquisitive ethic. So I talked a little bit about the acquisitive ethic before, this idea that the main purpose in life is just to acquire a lot of stuff and gratify your desires. Many important liberals or liberal aligned thinkers like Jeremy Bentham have held to that. But I argue, following Mill, Marx, and others, that actually people get a lot more satisfaction from the development of their human capacities, right? Becoming really good at YouTubing or really good at writing books, being a better husband, being a better friend, that kind of thing, right? And the development of these capacities is what liberal socialists tend to be committed to rather than this hedonistic, competitive, acquisitive ethic. And then last but not least, I argue that all liberal socialists are committed to economic democracy or the democratization in the economy and the elimination of forms of economic domination, but achieving that in a condition where liberal rights are respected and democratic norms are also given their due. Now, of course, when I say liberal rights, that does not include an expansive right to private property, since all liberal socialists are critical of the idea that people are entitled to private ownership of the commanding heights of the economy or the means of production, even if all liberal socialists, like most socialists everywhere, believe that people are entitled to forms of personal property.
So I'm curious how these kind of forms of liberalism or liberalisms, play against kind of the American tradition or how America has long viewed liberalism kind of as this like individualistic. And I think it plays into a lot of the other things you said, like more hedonistic, even like allowing for economic domination with like free market capitalism and such like that. So how does this kind of play against that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the history of the use of the term liberal in the United States is a pretty complicated one, right? Uh, if you were to go back and look at the writings of the founding fathers, very few of them would use the term liberal in the way that we would understand it contemporaneously, right? Basically, as a kind of left of center personality. The use of the term liberal really only started to become notably popular in the late 19th century, and especially during the heyday of the epoch of social Darwinism, right? Where oftentimes supporting liberalism was understood to mean supporting a market economy with a kind of competitive social structure, right? And there are roots of this that go very far back. Think about Thomas Jefferson arguing that the United States is going to be a society committed to natural aristocracies forming rather than artificial aristocracies. But really, the association of that with American liberalism only began a little bit later, right? But then in the 1930s, you see a pretty radical pivot under the auspices of people like FDR, who identified as a liberal and, of course, was committed to the idea that social Darwinism and a hyper-competitive economy were antithetical to liberal commitments to solidarity, keeping people free from want, offering everybody who wanted to work a job, that kind of thing. And since the 1930s, for the most part in the United States, the term liberal has been associated with this more center-left kind of outlook, or even far-left kind of outlook. And to be clear, a lot of classical liberals lamented that fact as early as the 1940s and 50s. People like F.A. Hayek in The Road to Serfdom or The Constitution of Liberty, or Milton Friedman complained that the term liberal had been co-opted by the left and New Dealers and so on. But in part because this seemed so impossible to change for a lot of them, instead they started developing new terms to describe themselves, like neoliberal or libertarian, that kind of thing. And they very much carry on in the tradition of this more possessive, atomistic strain of liberalism that you find in people like Hobbes.
So then you kind of spoke to the different parts or different isms in liberalism. What are some of the more positive elements of liberalism? I'm sure you write about it in your book that you think should or could be adopted into these leftist movements, like with socialism, especially to kind of fight back against the right-wing spaces, which are almost inherently illiberal at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I pointed out in an interview for Jacobin magazine not too long ago is that part of the inspiration for the book was I spent an awful lot of my time reading conservative and right-wing philosophy and right-wing intellectuals, and a lot of it is pretty bad, right? I'm not going to recommend anybody go out there and read a book by Gadsat or Jordan Peterson or anybody like that. But if you go deep into the tradition of the political right, what becomes really clear is that most of them did not consider themselves liberals in any respect. And in fact, many of them were extremely hostile to liberalism or even saw socialism as an outgrowth of the liberal tradition. And to a certain extent, my book is inspired by this claim because I think that people like Heidegger are right. Martin Heidegger, the famous German philosopher, when he says that there's a kind of metaphysical affinity between liberalism and socialism in the sense that both are humanistic Enlightenment doctrines committed to this idea that it's as important that your life goes well as that my life goes well. So there's a kind of egalitarian current to that. In terms of what do leftists have to learn from liberalism, it's funny that you asked that, right? Because another big motivation for the book was whenever I talk to leftists about liberalism, particularly like online leftists, the number one thing that a lot of them would say is, ooh, liberalism, don't want anything to do with that. And to a certain extent, I can empathize with that. I want to be clear, right? A lot of people who call themselves liberal, especially in the United States, don't hold the view to positions that I would want anything to do with. But when I got deeper into it, I would ask them questions like, well, do you believe in things like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the right to vote, right? Most leftists would say, well, obviously, I believe in all that. Why are you even asking me such a dumb question, right? If anything, they'd usually say, we believe in those things more than most classical liberals or neoliberals because we really believe that everyone should be entitled to those rights, not just the very rich or the very powerful or Americans, et cetera, right? And my point in this book was just to kind of make a lot of those impulses or these intuitions about the importance of things like freedom of expression, et cetera, more explicit to a lot of progressives by saying there's a way of holding to socialist commitments while retaining the things that are valuable in liberalism.
So I think that rather than be antithetical, they kind of help each other go hand in hand in some of the ways, pushing back against maybe some of the more negative aspects you can see from liberalism, like this, like you said, the natural aristocracy, where a lot of the times it ends up being, those on the top feel like they deserve to be there, and those on the bottom then are just lazy and need to work harder. Where this kind of adding like the socialism elements to it can kind of have like in an egalitarian sense even to help everyone accomplish more of their self like the goals that they would have, or to be able to put themselves in a better position rather than the individualistic way that some people like to look at like the economy and things.
Absolutely right. So there's been a lot written about meritocracy by progressives, a lot of it very deep and very probing, right? But I want to make very clear, right, that liberal socialists are not committed to what we might call a meritocratic ideal, and they see it as actually contrary to the spirit of liberalism. But before we get into arguing about that, there is no doubt that possessive strains or classical liberal strains of liberalism tended to have a lot of good things to say about what ultimately becomes meritocracy, right? And these go all the way back to people like Locke, right? So Locke, very important liberal or proto-liberal thinker, depending on who you talk to, insisted that the earth belonged to the rational and industrious. Which notably did not include the indigenous peoples of North America, right? And this flowed from his idea that, look, human beings are inherently entrepreneurial, and they start out in a state of equality in nature, but then they better themselves through their labor and through their industry, right? And the more industrious and the more rational people who work harder are just inherently going to get richer. And people like Jefferson, who I mentioned before, really take this idea and run with it in important ways that eventually serve as the kind of foundation bet for American notions of meritocracy. So Jefferson claims, again, that there's an artificial aristocracy that you see in Europe, basically the old feudal system, that is in many ways the worst possible things because it allows people to inherit wealth and power purely by happenstance of birth. But there's also a natural aristocracy of people who are rational, industrious, talented, and a good society tries to create space for these people to rise more or less as high as they possibly can go, right? And the critics of this view have always pointed out a huge variety of different problems. First off, it's not clear how you could even establish a viable meritocracy when it's so obvious to anybody with common sense that we definitely do not all start out in a position of equality, right? Some people start out with, trust funds attached to their name, and their parents are already saving for them to go to Harvard or Yale, whatever it happens to be, from not even birth, right, but before they're even born, right? Other people start off with parents who beat the crap out of them and then abandon them at age 8, right? So the lack of equal opportunities starting from a very young age is a serious problem with this. But more probing critics of meritocracy, like the good leftist theorist Wendy Brown or the communitarian Michael Sandel, have pointed out that these meritocratic ideals have an enormously toxic effect on our political culture. In some ways, more toxic than even the older feudal system. And the reason is they say, look, at least under the old feudal system, if you happen to be a peasant, you can console yourself with the idea that, look, God just put me here, right? I have a role to play in God's plan, but it's not my fault that I'm poor. It's just the kind of slot that God has decided that I fit into. And eventually I'm going to be rewarded when I get to heaven for, fulfilling my duty as I'm supposed to. And aligned with that, right? Many feudal thinkers like Robert Filmer or, going all the way back to Thomas Aquinas would argue that the nobility has a kind of sense of noblesse obligée that they have to show to the peasantry because they were designated by God to look after their citizens, right? Now, I'm not defending feudal aristocracy at all, right? But that's a kind of consoling narrative in some ways. By contrast, what Brown and Sandel point out about meritocracy is meritocracy puts forward this idea, again, totally false, that if you have made it in society, you did so through your own efforts, and consequently, you owe nothing to anyone at the bottom, right? You pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, and you got to where you got, and you didn't need anybody to help get there, right? And even worse, the kind of inverse of this idea that the rich got to where they got through their own merits is this notion that if you are poor and disadvantaged, then you're just, to put it in proper Trumpese, a loser, right? You couldn't cut it. You weren't talented. You weren't good enough. You're lazy. And you deserve to be cleaning toilets at McDonald's for the rest of your life. And that's all you're going to get because we don't owe anything to you if we belong to the kind of upper echelons. And Brown and Sandel point out that this is a very toxic idea, right? It offers no kind of psychological consolations to the people at the bottom for their status. It readily encourages an extraordinary sense of vanity and selfishness on a part of the plutocrats. And it should come as no surprise, they point out, that in the long run, we become very dissatisfied living in societies that are like this, right? Mm-hmm. Now, just to pivot briefly, I know I'm talking for a long time, so I'll wrap this up quickly. Liberal socialists have always disagreed with this idea that we should inculcate a society that's committed to these meritocratic norms. And this goes all the way back to John Stuart Mill certainly believed that it was important to kind of foster human excellence and human potential, right? It's not like he sat there and just thought it would be a good idea for us all to sit around in our basements playing Mario Kart all day. Although, you know, that's not a bad thing, here and there out. But he would say things like, look, the reality is that in a society like the one we live in, a capitalist society, it's very, very rare that the people at the top got where they were because they deserve it. And it's even less true that the people at the bottom are where they are because they deserve it. In fact, Mill pointed out that very often the people who work hardest in a capitalist society and do the most important jobs, you know, the people who lay brick or plumbers or electricians or whatever, are often the ones that society looks down upon the most, even though they do most of the work and they do the hardest work out there. So a meritocracy, according to Mill, generates all these very weird, distorting, contradictory kinds of impulses as the rich try to congratulate themselves for basically just being rich and doing very little. And the poor are told to feel bad about themselves, even though they're the ones that really build the society that all the rest of us depend on more often than not, right? And every liberal socialist going forward is going to build upon or develop these kinds of intuitions.
Yeah, I really do think when people try to put that kind of idea out there, it's really built on a false premise as it lacks a lot of context. Like there's a dice roll of like what you're born into first that decides, and then you're getting born into a system that inherently favors those who haven't been oppressed by capitalism, right? And those who have been oppressed by the system will likely continue to be, and it's harder to fight out from the bottom to the top. And I mean, especially like as you said, those who work the hardest typically aren't at the top, which if it was a true meritocracy, you would think that they would be. Instead, it kind of inspires people or motivates them just to work just hard enough that then they can make money off of others' hard work rather than having to do the work themselves. And I guess to go to the next question, which I am really curious what your perspective will be, because as a lefty myself, I know that the belief, especially among lefties, about there being these different socialized or social programs that would be huge steps forward for America that we could enact from, I mean, like single payer healthcare, like
Yeah.
education, childcare, even you could go down the list. But to me, I think the real importance should be placed on kind of shifting that power imbalance of like towards the worker, away from the owner, away from like the elite, from the wealthy, this kind of thing with like whatever it may be, redistributive like policies, these kinds of things. Is that something that you kind of agree with going into that? And then what do you believe to kind of get there are like the core parts of socialism that should be adopted into more liberal socialism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a few things that I want to say about this.
Mhm.
So one of the big questions that I get asked all the time is, well, what makes your position different than social democracy, for example, right? And I want to make clear, I agree with Gary Dorian, who's a great historian of socialism and social democracy, that the distinction between socialism and social democracy is a continuum rather than a kind of hard and fast one, right? There are social democrats who are more radical than their counterparts. And there are socialists that are more moderate than some of the people on the extreme left. So just to get that out of the way, first and foremost, saying that, I do think that one of the biggest flaws with, let's call it European social democracy and America's kind of half-hearted effort at social democracy was precisely that even though a lot of the redistributive welfarist programs that were introduced are good things, and I don't think there's any denying that, right? I mean, if we were able to achieve universal health care in this country, my God, that would be a big step forward, right? Including for me, since I wouldn't have to pay all these goddamn deductibles, right?
Same, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Amen. Right. But the big problem with social democracy was precisely that there wasn't enough of a coordinated effort to seriously challenge the power of capital in a sustained way. And this meant, and David Harvey wrote a really good book about this, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. In the 1970s, when the very marginal power of some of these working movements or workers' movements declined, it was very easy for capital to kind of stage a counterattack and roll back even the limited gains that workers and other marginalized groups have been able to obtain, aided by social democratic politicians. So liberal socialists had to be committed to the idea that just as important as introducing redistributive programs that make people's lives better have to be efforts to kind of undo the forms of economic domination that exist in a neoliberal capitalist society. Now, in terms of what solutions liberal socialists have put forward for this, it's pretty varied, right? I mean, one of the things that I point out in my book is that this is not a monolithic tradition in the sense that everybody has the same kinds of ideas. They have different solutions to the problems posed by capital and different visions of what liberal socialism would look like. In terms of what I think we should do, there are three things, right? First off is we really need to rejuvenate the labor movement wholeheartedly. And I'm happy to say that it seems like there have been some movements towards that in the US over the last couple of years. Not nearly enough, right? But it is something that we've seen things like Amazon unionize and in some places and Starbucks unionize. And a Democratic president walked a picket line, right? Which I never thought would happen either, right? Not revolutionary stuff, but you take your
Baby
victories where you
steps.
find them.
Yeah.
Yeah, baby steps, right? Second, and more importantly, and here I draw on the important liberal theorist Elizabeth Anderson. What really needs to be done is to implement liberal and democratic principles into the workplace, right? So Elizabeth Anderson wrote a really good book called Private Government, and she has another new one out called Hijack, which is also excellent. But what Anderson points out is, if you were to ask the average American, would you be okay with the government telling you when you could go to the washroom, when you're going to show up, what you're going to put on, like post on social media, who you're going to hang out with, what you're going to wear, and all that stuff? There would immediately be a fucking revolution, right?
Yeah.
If the government was going to do that, without a doubt, right? And yet Americans tolerate those kind of things every day from their bosses, right? There's just this understanding that once you enter into the workplace, into private government, you cede any kind of right to make decisions about these kinds of things. And so what Anderson says is we should be applying the kind of liberal principles that we already apply to the government to the workplace, make them democratically organized, ensure that workers have enjoy enormous rights relative to capital, and I would even go further than her and say gradually we should just try to get rid of capitalists, right? John Stuart Mill made exactly that proposal 2 centuries ago, where he said capitalists don't really do all that much. Workers can do everything that they do and probably better. So why do we need them, right? They're just a kind of unnecessary burden on the flourishing of the economy, right? So that's the second thing that I think we should do. And then the third thing I think is we should try to introduce many of those redistributive social programs that I think will play a major role in demonstrating to ordinary people that socialism and social democratic reforms can make a tangible impact on their lives and make things better in the short to medium run, right? So my good friends Megan Day and Micah Utrecht at Jacobin Magazine wrote a really good book called Bigger Than Bernie that I really suggest everyone take a look at. It's talking about the aftermath of the 2020 campaign. And what they say is, for most ordinary people who are attracted to socialist ideas, the big fear that they have is, well, if we change things, are they really going to get better, or will they get worse? And you can't blame people who are in a difficult situation from being worried about that, right? So we have to kind of show them, like, look, you got to be tired of paying these enormous healthcare premiums in this country and not being sure if you're going to be insured one year after another. Well, universal public healthcare will solve that, right? You've got to be really concerned about being able to pay for college for your kid because a lot of parents want to send their kid to college. Well, universal access to post-secondary will solve that, right? And I think that making the pitch to people that these things will tangibly make their lives better in the medium to short run or short to medium run, that's something that we can do to help make a lot of the other reforms to the power dynamics not only more palatable, but more comprehensive.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also hard to convince people with the propaganda machine in America pushing that people to act against their own best interests, that like capitalism is good for workers, even though it's what, and a lot of times keep them from being able to afford their house or afford their health care or these kinds of things. And I also agree with what you said. I was going to say that I think capitalists act as like a middleman, but I think that like maybe gatekeeper might be a better word, as they're like the guys in the more towards the top, but like in the middle, so to speak, keeping those under them down and helping those above them go even further up. But I did want to get to what might be some of the obstacles that could be faced in America applying to this, because I think it's relevant to a lot of what you just said. What I was speaking to, whether it be through law or even the almost ingrained traditional beliefs that some people, or as we know in the Constitution, even the Bill of Rights, right? It was written by property owners to kind of further the right of property owners of private capital, and in their case, a lot of times straight white male property owners. I mean, they weren't the most diverse group of people back then. But what are some of the barriers that still exist, and then how do you kind of fit this ideology into a framework that can get past those?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I could be here all day talking about that. So actually, I think I'll take your example as a prompt to maybe talk about some of the constitutional barriers, right? So I teach a class on constitutional interpretation at the University of Michigan. It's very interesting, and we go through a lot of case law. But one of the most interesting weeks that we have is when I talk about the Constitutional Convention and the ratification of the Constitution. So a lot of Americans don't know that actually only 6% of the population in 1789 was responsible for electing or having a say in the state delegates who went to the convention, who ended up deliberating on the Constitution, passing it. 6%, right? It's an extremely low number. And it wasn't like the founding fathers were aware of the fact that this was an extremely low number of people. People like Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife, wrote to him being like, hey, you know how you talk about how a tax on tea without representation is a form of tyranny, while the women of this country think that we might also be living under certain kinds of patriarchal tyranny. So maybe you should consider our interests when you're creating this new country, because anything that you can say to justify a revolution against the British, women could say relative to men. And Adams' response to that was, well, that's cute, but absolutely not, right? And so the Constitution that was created by these individuals was without a doubt a major step forward in some respects, right? I want to be very clear about that. If you were to ask me, do I want to live in a feudal society or American society, 1789, I would invariably say American constitutionalism was a big step forward, not for women and not for slaves and others, but for a lot of ordinary people. But a lot of the anti-democratic inclinations that the American founding fathers were very, very overt about made their way into the constitutional order that we now have through things like the Electoral College, through things like having 2 senators per state. Through things like having a very, very powerful Supreme Court that is able to overturn the will of the people. And I think that changing those anti-democratic institutions and practices is a vital step forward to really establishing a country where we, the people, are the ones that have the say, not plutocratic elites.
Yeah. So that was the last of the questions that I had for you. I was going to say this is the part usually where I say link to get the book in the description. But if I am correct, I don't think the book that was in question here doesn't come out till November. So I did want to give you a chance, I guess, if there was anything you want to shout out. If I'm mistaken, correct me. I don't know if you have like a website or maybe another piece you've written or a different book, something like that. You can go ahead and let people know where to find your stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Shameless capitalist behavior on my part, right? So, yeah, if people want, they can definitely pre-order the book. It's on the Routledge website, or if you want to be bad, it's on Amazon, right? If people are interested in learning a little bit more about this, though, I've written articles for Jacobin Magazine, Aeon Magazine, and coming out soon on Herd that kind of gesture to bigger parts of the argument or summarize the argument that might be of interest. And if people want to get in touch with me, they can always email me at mattmcmanus300@gmail.com. Or they can add me on Twitter. I'm never calling it X because fuck Elon, right?
Yeah.
So they can add me on Twitter at Matt Paulfroth.
Awesome. Well, I want to say again, thank you for taking the time to speak with us, fitting it in your schedule. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. I don't get to talk to many people who are left leaning on the left side of things, so it's always fun when I do.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to see you, man. And yeah, if you need anything else, just let me know.
Awesome. Enjoy the rest of your day.